Hello, Shehab. How are you?
Hi, Haidar. I'm great. Thank you for having me on your podcast.
Oh, it's a
And
pleasure. It's a pleasure.
apologies for the mix-up yesterday.
Well, it's the start of the Ramadan period, and we're both fasting, and we're recording this while we are both fasting. So, hopefully, we won't fall off and fall asleep while we're talking. But I mean, you know, you're a hand surgeon. And
Mhm.
how do you do it, doing hand surgery and fasting at the same time? And for some of the listeners out there, fasting during the month of Ramadan means no food, no water, no sex, of course. But hey, how are we going to have sex during surgery? But anyway, all that stuff. How do you stay concentrating while you're doing this sort of delicate hand surgery?
Well, good question. And what a question to start with. Yeah. Well, I started fasting at quite a young age. Um, I think as surgeons, actually, we don't eat very often, especially being a hand surgeon, plastic surgeon. We're quite used to the operating environment, standing there and doing an operation for 8, 9, 10 hours sometimes, and sometimes not even actually taking a break in that period of time. So I think it's quite a natural thing for surgeons, actually, in a way. Might sound strange, but yes, especially when you're operating in theater, high stakes, you tend to kind of zone out of the food aspect of life, and you tend to focus on the adrenaline rush. Kind of keep yourself going. I started fasting at, as I said, quite a young age, and I I got quite used to it. In fact, I feel that fasting and working actually go hand in hand, because I normally find that if I have lunch in the middle of the day, I tend to get sleepy after lunch, and fasting actually for me helps me to maintain concentration actually throughout the day. And I think I don't know what the latest evidence is for intermittent fasting, but there's quite a lot of work that shows that actually intermittent fasting, especially kind of the way the Ramadan fast is, helps you to increase concentration. Maybe the lack of water is slightly different and it is an added challenge, but I feel that my concentration actually improves during this month.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I find at the start of the month, particularly the first few days, can be a bit difficult, given that, I mean, I have a horrible diet regime. It's like whatever tastes salty and sweet, have as much as possible of it. And you sort of so it takes a few days for the body to kind of wean itself off the addiction of sugar and salt. But yeah, I mean, water is, or fluid balance is a big issue, I think. And something about brains need fluid, apparently, because it swims in lots of CSF and sort of what have you. So I guess that's the issue. But I mean, you get lots of these funny people that talk about, you need to drink fluid all the time, and all that kind of stuff, and as if the body's not intelligent enough to sort of maintain some kind of fluid balance.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that's the whole point of homeostasis.
Mm.
If I'm mistaken, I'm trying to remember my medical school physiology lessons, but that's homeostasis, isn't it? Trying to maintain all kinds of, trying to maintain balance overall, whether it be fluid, whether it be your temperature,
Yeah.
etc., to regulate things. Um, yeah, I think one of the challenges though with fasting, um, for me personally, and probably for people in our profession, is the fact that actually, despite you fasting, we actually are recommended to have at least 2 meals, right? So we break fast and we have our meal. and then at least you're supposed to have a meal during the middle of the night. Okay, so we're supposed to try and have 2 meals, and this is quite normal, right, for the intermittent fasting regime as well, because the intermittent fasting, the different regimes that are you're recommended to have at least 2 meals, if not 3. So I think the problem is that trying to wake up for that early morning meal is quite challenging. I think if we were able to do that a bit more, if I was, for me personally, I think if I was able to wake up in the morning and have that meal, I think it'll make fasting a lot easier. It's just trying to wake up is quite difficult. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important, and I think it's it's a habit, and if you're not used to the habit, it's difficult to do it unless it's you force yourself into it. I mean, the excuse is that one of the prayers is sort of before the sun rises, so the Fajr prayer. So maybe that's a reason why we need to sort of do that thing first thing in the morning, to get us used to praying 5 times a day and being part of the the whole Islamic family and ummah. But yeah, I mean, intermittent fasting has become quite a quite a movement, isn't it? Sort of, it's become quite sexy amongst a lot of people.
Yeah, I think intermittent fasting is great. Actually, I mean, it's another excuse to make sure that you're trying to control your diet and watch your weight. And, I don't know if you've heard of Dr. Fung. He's a renal physician from the States, and he's quite influential in this movement of fasting and
isn't he anti-carbs kind of person?
Yes, he's an he's not anti-carbs per se, but yes, he does say reduce your carbs and eating. I love the way he says, well, if you can't find time to eat, then reduce what you're eating. If you can't find the money to eat, then reduce what you're eating. So basically, any reason that you can find to reduce the amount of calories you're consuming in terms of carbs, he says use it, and use it to reduce your carb intake. As he has really good points with regards to intermittent fasting, why it's great. And I actually started intermittent fasting because I listened to quite a few of his lectures, and I found it quite eye-opening. And I don't, the whole treating diabetes with diet, and how you can reverse type 2 diabetes by getting yourself to lose weight through fasting and increasing your body's capability to react to insulin, because that's the problem with diabetes, right? Type 2 diabetes, it's your body's inability to respond to the circulating levels of insulin, and that is thought to be due to the high levels of adipose tissue that's built up. So it's quite interesting. I found the whole thing quite interesting, and I think there is quite a bit of evidence now building up in this regard, with regards to like intermittent fasting, losing weight in that manner, and then overcoming type 2 diabetes as a result. It's quite inspirational. It's quite the in thing to do now, intermittent fasting.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with you. I mean, when I see patients with macular edema and retinal edema and they're diabetic, I do spend a lot of time talking about diet and, particularly carbohydrates, and also weight loss, because, I'm of the opinion that all that fat tissue is pro-inflammatory. And, I mean, for me, I don't know about sort of, hand pathology, but most of it is actually inflammatory rather than any other, kind of major process. Okay, there's a lot of this thing about, increase in angiotensin and increase in VEGF and sort of things like that in terms of the retina. But I think the underlying issues is inflammation. And maybe adipose tissue is the thing that drives that inflammation. But hey, I've noticed that when I lose weight, my joints are much better. Whether that's a weight thing or an inflammatory thing, I've never gone down the taking bloods every week like Peter Attia. He's quite he does a lot of blood work on himself and his clients. Maybe that's something to think about for myself.
Yeah. I suppose it could be a combination of both and take some of the pressure off your joints, and maybe that's also going to help with reducing inflammation.
Yeah. And I mean, to be honest with you, when I don't eat any kind of heavy meal, I find that my focus is pretty much on the job, rather than anything else. And thinking about food and what the next meal is. And then if it's not a great meal, I do spend 5 or 10 minutes sort of complaining in my head, oh, it's another of these sandwiches or another of these. I'm not complaining because the wife does a great job and she, gives me some great food. But it's that extra.
Is she behind you with the
well, mate, if she was behind me, none of this would happen. It's I come into the office, I lock the door, I've got a lock on my door, so whatever happens. But I mean, obviously she listens to some of the episodes and then I'm in big trouble. But hey, what can I do? The man's got to say what he's got to say.
Absolutely. I think that's what you started this for, right?
Well,
to get out behind closed doors.
Well, I mean, I got in some really serious trouble, and I was being interviewed by quite a inflammatory doctor, and let's just say he
was he heavy on the influence tissue side?
Well, he got the juice out of me. He got all the juicy bits out of me, and oh my God, I was in big trouble with the wife, and so I've definitely toned down the wife rhetoric since then, because I do want to have a psychologically stable marriage. So yeah,
Oh goodness.
Yeah. So what why hand surgery? I mean, because for me, when I think of hands, I think, oh my God, all those delicate tissues. I mean, you guys use microscopes like we do, but it's like both, but it's like both macro and micro.
Yeah. So I'll be honest and say I initially thought of wanting to become an orthopedic surgeon. I was quite interested in bones, and I am still interested in bones. However, I did do some rotations in orthopedics when I was an FY2, so that's a foundation year 2 doctor, so junior minion basically, and I found it very physically demanding, and I felt that it was so physically demanding that it was something that probably wasn't very suited to me because I had back problems, and I couldn't see myself holding a tibial fracture in reduction for 2 hours while they put a nail through the tibia. It was just not something I could do. And at the same time, I spent a bit of time with a hand surgeon at St. George's. So the hand unit in St. George's is the place where I first got exposed to hands. That kind of opened my eyes to how much the hand is involved in day-to-day activities. So the hands are not only kind of involved in you doing things with it. So, it's also the second most important part of your body that expresses emotion in a way. Okay, so obviously your face is smiling and grinning, and your face, your hands are the next organ that actually expresses yourself, right? Because you use sort of hand gestures and hand motions and so on. And so that whole aspect of the hands actually, your brain thinks of something, but your hands is what makes those ideas and thoughts come to life, right? So when I saw people in a clinic, in this hand clinic, being so thankful following their hand operation and their hand, being returned back to the ability to do something normal, I found it to be very satisfying, even though obviously I wasn't doing the operations at that point in time. I found it very satisfying to see patients come in and thank the surgeon for whatever they'd done to their hand and improved whatever injury or trauma or whatever condition they were suffering from. So that left a really indelible mark in my mind with regards to hands and how important they are, and the fact that it was quite nice surgery as well. It was nice, clean surgery. You had all of these tissues to deal with because a hand has bones, soft tissue, nerves, blood vessels, tendons, so quite intricately structured. So all of these things meant that quite early on, I became interested in hands, and I thought this is something I could see myself doing. And then from that point onwards, I had to make a decision as to whether I do orthopedics or plastics and which route do I take to hand surgery. And I felt the plastic surgery route was probably more scenic because of all the soft tissue involved, the fact that you get to see a lot, a whole spectrum of other things. And plastic surgery is actually quite a large specialty. Anything in any other surgical specialty that people didn't want to do, it would end up with a plastic surgeon. So this is kind of the reason why I thought I'll do hands, and I'll go down the plastic surgery route to hands rather than the orthopedic route. But I tried very hard during my training to try and not see hand surgery as either plastic or orthopedic, but to combine the two, and just approach hands as its own specialty and learn from both orthopedic and plastic surgeons. So yeah,
what was the sort of the most common kind of hand surgery at the time when you started your training back in St. George's?
So obviously hand surgery, you can divide it into your trauma workload and elective hand surgery. Okay, so trauma could be anything. There's a whole gamut of work there, and you could just be a specialist in hand trauma and you'll have enough work to fill 5 days a week. So that trauma involves things like fractures, tendon injuries, nerve injuries, simple nail bed injuries, all the way up to the most complicated aspects of hand surgery where people cannot come with their thumbs amputated and you'll be connecting them back. So we call that a replant. And sometimes even multiple fingers or even the whole hand being amputated and result you having to connect it up together. And these are long operations, could last anything from 3 to 4 hours to the longest one that I've been involved in, which is around 19 hours. So it's a whole spectrum of complexity. And then you have your elective, so the non-urgent hand surgery presentation. So the common things like carpal tunnel syndrome, trigger finger, Dupuytren's disease, and glands, tumors, and so on. As well as if you go into wrist surgery, you have all of the other aspects of hands, such as arthritis, osteoarthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, and all the ligament injuries and ligament instabilities. So it's a lot of work there.
And what's your favorite hand operation?
That's well, I don't have a favorite per se. I enjoy all of it, but I would say that in terms of a subspecialty interest within hands, I'm trying to develop arthroscopy as a subspecialty interest. So this is, it's essentially inserting a camera and an operating probe and doing arthroscopic wrist surgery. So that's an area I would like to develop. So that's my interest and that's my subspecialist area. So wrist and arthroscopic wrist surgery.
I mean, it's a small place. I mean, how does that work?
Oh yes, yeah, it is a small place, but it is arthroscopes are coming to the fore now over the last 10 to 15 years. There's quite a lot of work. So it started off diagnostically. So diagnostic wrist arthroscopy was something that people were doing to look at the wrist and in a minimally invasive way assess what's going on with the wrist. But over time, people have managed to now have or add an interventional component to the diagnostic aspects of arthroscopic wrist surgery. So interventional arthroscopic wrist surgery is becoming quite advanced, and it's something that is a developing field, and not a lot of surgeons still do it, but it is an area that is rapidly gaining momentum because of the fact that you could minimally invasively treat a lot of wrist pathology, which is fantastic for wrists because the less you disrupt the soft tissues above the wrist, the faster the recovery and the less damage you'll be causing to the rest of the hand, in a way.
What kind of surgery? I mean, what kind of pathologies are they treating arthroscopically?
So arthroscopically, wrist osteoarthritis is a key disease that they're treating arthroscopically, mainly for grading the level of arthritis in the wrist. But there are other things you can do, like, for example, scaphoid fracture fixations, TFCC, debridements, ganglion excisions. So there, scapholunate ligament injuries. So various pathologies in the hand that can be treated with arthroscopic wrist surgery. Of course, it is difficult in that you can't treat everyone arthroscopically. It has to be quite carefully chosen patients and carefully chosen pathologies. But there definitely is a role for it, and I am interested in developing that as a subspecial interest for myself.
Yeah. I mean, you've got to pick a niche and sort of excel in that niche, and particularly if it's something that sort of speaks to you. Well, what's the most horrendous hand injury that you had to get involved with repairing?
Okay, so I think one of the most horrendous ones that I had to get involved in was a chap that was involved in some kind of tussle. I call it a tussle. With a blade, ended up cutting his thumb completely off, and this is the thumb, not at what we call the MCP joint, but at the carpometacarpal joint, so right at the base of the thumb, which makes it very, very challenging to connect it back. But the injury happened around 1 a.m. in the morning. We got into theatre around 2 a.m. and all through the night. We worked all through the night to try and connect this back together, but unfortunately it didn't work. And it's just a reminder that, yes, there are wonderful things we can do today with microscopes and sutures that are as thin as a hair, and various instruments, microsurgical instruments and techniques. But despite that, there's always a possibility that it may not work. And so, yeah, prevention is better than cure if you can prevent.
Yeah. I mean, your voice cut up. I mean, I heard the knife. So how did the thumb come off? Was it he sort of cut himself with a knife, or?
No, he was essentially he was attacked by an individual.
Oh, right. Yes.
Yes, with a blade that is a very large blade, essentially, which is like a sword.
My God. I mean, it brings back memories. Well, not memories, but sort of images of medieval sword fighting. I'm sure there were lots of limbs coming off in those days.
Well, you can have a representation of those medieval activities on a Friday or a Saturday night.
Wow.
Depending on the location you are based in.
Wow. Well, I mean, you're originally from Sri Lanka, and there's a lot of issues there currently in Sri Lanka, and so what's going on there? I mean, we don't hear much of it in the news.
Well, Sri Lanka has had, I mean, look, it's had issues for as far as I can remember.
Yeah.
Okay, but over the last 10 to 15 years, it's had more issues than in the past 50 or so years. And unfortunately, a lot of it is linked to corruption. And each of the leaders trying to outdo each other in terms of corruption. So the current ruling family is probably the most corrupt rulers that the country has had in all of its 70-odd years of independence. And essentially, the corruption coupled with very poor decision making with regards to who they take loans from, how they take loans, and essentially, finance, essentially all those things that are essential for keeping a GDP running have essentially been obliterated. So, for example, they took loans from China at very high interest rates, knowing that they won't be able to pay. Sovereign loans, they have massive amounts of sovereign debts, which are debts that governments take for emergency relief payments. So they've got massive sovereign debt. So every few months, one of these sovereign debts matures and they need to repay it with massive amounts of interest, and they just can't afford the interest repayments. And this current government, what they did was they cut tax that resulted in a massive decrease in the amount of state revenue. So that then coupled with COVID-19, a reduction in tourist numbers, and all of that then essentially snowballing into a massive reduction in foreign exchange, essentially the US dollar. So there's almost no US dollars to fund any imports. So as a result of all of this, the country is in a deep financial and economic crisis.
Yeah. And I mean, there's a big diaspora of Sri Lankans. What's their view about this? And I mean, I know quite a few Sri Lankans, and they seem very prosperous and well off here in the West. What's their general sense of this? I mean, is it something for them to get involved in, or is it like, well, it's a mess and I've got my own problems to deal with here?
Well, yeah, I mean, yes, most people would have that attitude, okay, that this is something external to me, and I don't have anything left there, and there's not much I can do anyway.
Yeah.
Okay. Obviously, it depends on whether you've got an interest, something based in Sri Lanka. So if you've got property or if you've got money based in Sri Lanka, then obviously that's going to affect you a lot more than if you've got nothing, no interests, based in that particular location. So I can tell you that the Sri Lankan rupee, for example, has depreciated over the last 2 years by 50%. So around about, if I remember correctly, 2018, June 2018, the dollar was cruising at around 150, 160 rupees. Today, the dollar is at close to 300, 298, 299. So that's massive, massive depreciation in the price of the rupee. And the government has tried, and unfortunately, all the actions they've taken, unfortunately, are always a little too late. They wait for they wait for a catastrophe and then make a decision. They don't preemptively make a decision to try and avert the catastrophe. They wait for the catastrophe, then try and make a decision to try and correct whatever they've done. So it always plays out as negative as a result. So, for example, they artificially pegged the dollar to a certain value, and this was a bad move because it meant that people were just waiting for the day when they had to unpeg it, and the rupee would crash. And that's what just happened like a couple of months ago. The rupee just suddenly they unpegged it to try and get people to bring in their dollars, and unfortunately, it's had the opposite effect. People have run away from putting money into Sri Lanka as a result. So, yeah, the diaspora could have a part to play, and the government are trying to encourage the diaspora to come in and put their money in and try and do something for the country. Okay, but I think overall it's a question of trust, and would you trust a government who's been so corrupt and continues to always be on the back foot when it comes to decision making? Would you then trust them to give you a return? Would you take your money in there? I don't think the diaspora are going to invest or bring their hard-earned money into a country where there is rampant.
Yeah. Coming back to to hand surgery, how has it changed since you started, your sort of FY1 job, and sort of now, coming towards the end of, all your training, and, about to start a consultant job? How's hand surgery and sort of hand surgery in the NHS has changed?
So, I'm just gonna adjust this again. So hand surgery in the NHS, well, there was a point in time, I can't remember now, maybe a couple of years ago, maybe 3 years ago, there was a point in time where they were going to, well, the powers that be, so the Department of Health, essentially was going to remove essential hand surgery operations such as Dupuytren's release, trigger finger release, all of these basic important hand surgery operations, of which we do tons and from which patients benefit a whole heap. They were going to remove all of this from the NHS.
Wow.
Based on a misunderstanding, and this was, I think this was during Jeremy Hunt's tenure. So I think the British Society for Surgery of the Hand has done a lot of work to try and convince the Department of Health, which they finally managed to eventually, that the decision to remove basic hand surgery operations from being provided on the NHS was a bad idea. So there was going to be a huge change and a major uproar, but fortunately we managed to put it back from the edge. But I suppose coming to a question of, has it changed a lot since I was in FY2? It's probably not changed all that much, but I would say that there is a increasing recognition that a hand surgeon needs to be an individual not aligned to plastics or orthopedics per se. So it's okay to accept that they will come through those routes, but I think there is an increasing recognition that hand surgeons are hand surgeons and they should have experience in both plastic and orthopedic aspects of hand surgery. And it's not, accepted anymore just to say, oh, I'm a plastic hand surgeon, so I don't know anything about the wrist, or I'm an orthopedic hand surgeon, so I don't know anything about microsurgery. It's becoming less accepted and it's becoming more expected that a hand surgeon is, adequately skilled in all aspects of hand surgery and not just what is considered to be orthopedics or plastics.
And in terms of the actual surgical experience, has that changed over the years? Being exposed to different surgeries.
That's a difficult question, actually. I think the exposure is obviously, as you may have, recognized, the exposure obviously is becoming more difficult for trainees, if that's what you mean. It means that individuals like myself who want to become hand consultants probably need to take a year out and do a specialist fellowship in hand surgery. If you wanted to become a hand surgeon, you can't expect to get adequate hand surgery experience purely during your registrar or residency training. You will have to do an advanced fellowship nowadays. So that's important. And I would say that obviously the knowledge and the amount of conditions we treat is just rapidly expanding every single day. So trying to keep up is quite difficult. And that one does need to develop what could be described as a super specialty interest. So that's why I mentioned wrist surgery to you, because I want to obviously develop that as my super specialist interest within hands. So that's also becoming, quite a common theme now for one to develop a super specialist interest in one aspect of the specialty that they're in.
Yeah. And in terms of wrist, I mean, if you can give us and the listeners, what kind of top tips do you have for sort of good wrist health? Given that some of us use our wrist very, 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 very much often on a regular basis.
Yes. Well, for good wrist health, that's a difficult question, actually.
Because I was doing some bench press the other day, and I thought to myself, oh, I need to make sure the wrist is okay and it's in the right position, and then you come along, and I thought, well, wrist, come on, man, wrist health.
Yes.
A blog about wrist health.
about wrist health, yes. Well, the wrist is, a very complex. It's probably one of the most complex structures in your body. And it's designed in a very intricate manner. And the way it's designed is such that you have force transmission through your fingers, through your carpal bones, and onto your radius and ulna. Okay. So I suppose you need to understand a bit about your wrist, if you are to, have good wrist health, I suppose. So that's a very basic overview of what your wrist comprises and how the forces are transmitted through it. So you've got a number of, then following those bones, you've got a number of ligaments, you've got nerves, and you've got cartilage and synovial fluid, all of which are important in cushioning things and making sure that the wrist doesn't move beyond the limits it's supposed to be moving. Okay. So if you're doing something like a bench press or even just lifting weights, free weights, it'll be quite important that you have a wrist support, I would say. Wearing wrist supports can significantly reduce the strain that is going through the joints and reduce the risk of injuring ligaments, and especially something called your TFCC, which, if they do get injured, they're quite difficult to treat. So again, prevention is better than cure. So wrist supports, I would recommend them. And it's very important that you wear one, especially if you're doing something that you're going to an action that's going to increase or put significant forces through your wrist. Okay. The other thing is obviously avoiding significant torsional forces on your wrist. So try not to, do things where you are putting your wrist in a very contorted position and then trying to push out with your wrist or pull through, because that torsional force could obviously convert itself into a wrist injury. Okay. Apart from that, obviously, if you're doing something that's aggravating things, stop doing it, because your body's trying to tell you something. And just general I suppose common sense, trying not to obviously positions that positions where you are repetitively causing strain to it. Interestingly, I remember seeing a cardiologist who was having trouble with his wrist because he was using this instrument constantly every day or most days of the week, which was putting a lot of strain on his wrist. So the only way forward for him was to use a splint and try and reduce that activity or modify that activity. So if you are facing difficulties with your wrist and you're getting a lot of pain with it, it might be that you may need to change that activity or alter it, or use the splint, or even have some painkillers and non-steroidal anti-inflammatories to help with the pain if there is some discomfort. But the best way to treat these kind of things is to reduce the activity that's causing this aggravation, essentially.
Yeah. I mean, I use a watch on my wrist to give it support. Does that count?
Watches. This is something that has crossed my mind. Watches and wrist supports, and designing a watch that could, support your wrist at the same time as, providing some stability, providing a place where you can leave your watch. But I have yet to come up with something like this. I'm sure there's something in the market.
Well, it's an interesting project because you're in the market yourself, and that's one of the major reasons why I contacted you, because I love watches and I've always been fascinated by those ticking things. You must be in the fetus when you got interested in watches.
Yeah, I think I was definitely interested in watches much earlier in my life than I was interested in hands, to be honest. As a child, I loved watches, and obviously that came from my family background in jewelry and watches, and accessories of that kind, really. My first high value purchase was a watch, which I bought when I was probably 13, 14 for all of my pocket money. I bought a Seiko watch with all of my pocket money, partially financed, of course, by my mom. But yes, I used every penny that I had. Well, at that point, it was rupees, not pennies. Every rupee that I had, I spent it on a watch. And I still have the watch to this day. But yes, you're absolutely right. Watches was something I was interested in even before hands.
Well, what kind of watch was it? It was a Seiko. What color was it? Do you remember the make or?
Yeah, it was it's a standard Seiko quartz chronograph. I don't know why I needed a chronograph, but it just looked nice, so I went and bought a chronograph. Um, yeah, and I think it's given up the ghost now, but it lasted me a good 10 years, good 10, 15 years, and it still looks the part, you know. Um,
What's your favorite
yeah.
colors?
Oh, colors wise, well, that was a silver watch, and the
Yeah.
dial was also silver. It had some really nice um, little red highlights with some orange uh, hands. So all made for a very nice aesthetic, actually. And that's what actually resulted in me buying it. Obviously, I had to think about the budget as well, and it had to be within budget. But that was the watch at that point. Getting, but in terms of color, and as you know, we've got the Clerkenwell uh, collection, the Hawchester Clerkenwell uh, automatics and the quartz chronographs. The Oxford blue is my favorite color out of all of them, but obviously I love all of them because they're my babies, you know.
Yeah. So the ocean is your favorite baby.
Yes, the Clerkenwell Oxford blue.
Oh, Oxford blue. Yeah. So that's your favorite one. And how many other colors do you have?
So it's four other, so basically five colors in total. So there's the Oxford blue, the Tudor red, Dover white, Cannock black, and the Cumbrian green. So they're all British themed, obviously from either the history or British landscapes, essentially.
And so you haven't thought of going back into your old watch and sort of servicing it or seeing what's wrong with it? And
Yeah, that's a good question. I've serviced and looked through a few watches, but I never actually looked through this one. I probably should. That's a good thought. I need to find some time to do that. Yeah.
I mean, not that you have any time anyway, given that you're, fasting and sort of hand surgeon and, all these other things that you have to do. But, I mean, I've got my remote control car behind me, which has stopped working, and I should really get back to it and, tinker around inside and see why it stopped working. I guess it brings back, some uncomfortable memories.
Yeah, no, I think I should. Especially the problem with that watch would be that in my head I've already written it off in the sense that
Yeah.
it's probably given up the ghost because quartz. Well, you can't call quartz a movement per se, but quartz watches and batteries. If the battery is leaked, which is what I am assuming it has done, salvaging it can be quite difficult. But then you could just take out the whole quartz movement and replace it with a new quartz. So, yeah, that is a possibility.
So you've got family's always been involved in essentially jewelry and also watches. You know, why did you go into medicine? What was the conflict there?
Okay, so yes, so we've had gem trading and watches, I would say, for around 4 to 5 generations in the family. So it's something that we've been doing, a very, very long time. My dad was a specialist in Sri Lankan blue sapphires. So that was his specialism and interest. And actually, a fun fact, Kate Middleton's blue sapphire, the engagement ring that she's got.
Right, yeah.
That blue sapphire is actually a Sri Lankan blue sapphire, it's a cornflower blue sapphire.
Oh wow.
And that was supplied by my dad, actually.
Wow.
Uh, so that's my claim to fame there. But yeah, we've had this for generations. But I think the reason why I went down the medical route was probably, I would say, threefold. Okay, I would say that firstly, um, I was fortunate enough and I was hardworking enough to be able to get the grades. Okay, so I got the grades, so that's one thing. Based on um, a natural resource that was going to run out at some point. So his feeling was, look, don't do the business because it's a natural resource, it's going to run out and we're not going to have a business at the end of it, which is, in a way, probably not a rational fear because it's still going and they've been doing it for 5 generations. But I bought into that because that's what I was told. And thirdly, I'll be honest and say that I was always interested in physics and the way things moved and mechanics, and probably this is why I have an interest in watches. But I just couldn't figure out as a 17, 18-year-old what I could do with physics. I couldn't see a exit strategy having done a physics degree. So I chose medicine as probably, because it was a safer career choice in a way. But come to think of it now, 18 years down the line, I'm quite happy with where I am. I love hands. I love operating. It's really fun. Yes, there are gripes that you have with the NHS and the way it works, and difficulties with the system, but it's a whole lot better than a lot of the other systems around the world, and we get to operate on almost everyone without having to turn them away, and that's a fantastic privilege.
Yeah, I mean, we all have dodgy family members, but there are some families that are much worse than ours. So,
Yeah.
I'm not going to complain that much. I mean, it's bad, but it's not that bad.
Mm-hmm.
So, given that you sort of, going through medicine, and then why did you go back to sort of watchmaking? Because it feels though you're coming back, to sort of full circle.
Yeah. So what happened? So there are a number of things actually. Again, so around 2014 December, my father suddenly passed away, and that got me thinking about life. Obviously, you become a bit more philosophical and introspective when you have some form of, I'll say a difficult moment, or that kind of grief, an event that causes some grief. So you start, go into this introspective mode and start thinking about, oh, I've actually only got another 30 years on this earth, or another 35 years. Do I want to only experience what it's like to work in the NHS, or do I want to experience other things? So that's one part of it. Then the second part, of course, was, look, my dad and his family have done all of this for this long. I need to do something to salvage this great history that my family has within this kind of trade and within jewelry and so on. So, you have that thought process in the back of your mind. And the other thing was also, I was quite stressed and work was quite stressful. And I thought there had to be a way to relax. And I thought designing watches was something that I always wanted to do. Why not try it out? So all of these things culminated in me starting to design watches. And then eventually I met a friend of mine who kind of suggested, why don't we make watches? Why don't we try and, develop this as as a business, probably. Me being who I am and being quite, being quite the person to go and build something from scratch, I felt, look, if we're going to do this thing with watches, I'm not just going to, put my logo on some other person's watch and say, oh, this is my watch. I'm going to do it, from scratch and right from the beginning. And that's why I went straight down to designing the watches myself, selecting the parts, selecting the manufacturer, designing the packaging myself, designing the logo myself, and actually building everything from top to bottom, and not just taking the easy route out, which would have been just to go to a manufacturer and go, look, can you put my logo on your watch and we can sell it off as my own? And it's that's something that never sat comfortably with me, will never sit comfortably with me. And so I went ahead and designed my own, built my own, and created it, with my kind of aesthetic and my thoughts about design.
And how would you describe your design? I mean, you mentioned sort of the whole British flavor to things. How else would you do?
Now that you mentioned that, the other thing that really inspired me, actually, just before I answer your question, was the British history of watchmaking. That was actually a fourth factor, because I love history. I've always been, somebody who's into history. I mean, I won the history prize a few times in school. So history was, again, another very interesting subject for me. But when I started reading about the British history of watchmaking, I actually started to learn that watchmaking was actually a pioneering British activity in a way. So a lot of the advancements in mechanical watchmaking and clockmaking came from British craftspeople. So, the British were ahead in terms of watchmaking, far ahead of the Swiss, okay, between the 16th to the 19th centuries. So for 200 to 300 years, the British were at the pinnacle of watchmaking and clockmaking. Unfortunately, due to taxes and the world wars, the British industry was decimated as a result, and a lot of the watchmakers couldn't afford to carry on. They had to sell their equipment and sell their tools and so on. And a lot of the trade then ended up going to Switzerland. And funny enough, Rolex was incorporated in London, okay, by a British and a Swiss individual, so Hans Wilsdorf, and forgive me, but I can't remember the British individual's name, but they incorporated in the UK, and then eventually they moved it to Switzerland.
Oh, that's okay, because it's, woke culture now prevails, so we're not supposed to remember any of the British history of the past and so on, the good stuff.
That was a key, inspiration for me. Sorry, what was your question again? I answered a completely different question.
Well, I can't remember, but I mean, it was, what's your kind of style and your sort of flavor of
inspiration behind the design? Yes, I think that's what we were talking about. So the inspiration behind the design really came from, so obviously I knew that the brand, or if I was ever going to create a brand, it needed to be a British, to have a heavy British influence, because obviously I was inspired by this history of British watchmaking. And that's why Clerkenwell, because Clerkenwell was but in terms of the design itself, a lot of the design cues were taken from British automobiles, because that was the one aspect that I could think of as being still very British and very recognizably British. So brands like Rolls-Royce, Bentley, McLaren, and so on, which are, luxury kind, obviously not McLaren, but Bentleys and Rolls-Royces and Jaguars and so on. They're very muscular, very British, have a very uniquely British design philosophy. I use them as the philosophy behind Hawchester watches, and you can see that because the watches are quite chunky. They've got the muscular build of a British luxury car. The components, are 316L stainless steel, sapphire glass crystal, tapestry pattern dial, genuine leather. So I'm trying to obviously, use components in a similar way. And then, for example, the red second hand on the watch. So if you look at the Hawchester watches, they've all got a red second hand, and this was to kind of make it similar to the red RPM counter meter that you would find in sporty versions of British luxury cars. So there's a lot of kind of thought processes that went into designing the watch and trying to translate the design from the British car to a watch. And obviously, you as somebody who's observing it could inform me better whether it's done the job or not. But I hope that whatever I've done, translates at least reasonably well, if not well.
Yeah, I mean, it has a very traditional sense to it. How does this sort of British tradition sit with your Sri Lankan heritage and background?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, I feel that it sits quite comfortably, I would say. I mean,
yeah,
I feel that yes, there were things that colonization, and I don't want to shy away from on any of these things, but I do feel that there were aspects to colonization that were probably beneficial to certain other societies, and probably are probably because of the fact, because I'm Sri Lankan, I can say it. Whereas, if you're a Brit, I am Sri Lankan and I am British in a way. I can say it and say, look, I think there were certain benefits. Okay, obviously there were issues that needed to be dealt with as well. Okay, expropriating a nation's wealth and so on. But there are certain things that were left behind that we could have benefited from. And to be honest, look at Sri Lanka now. It would have been, far better if the British were there. This is probably very controversial for me to say,
yeah.
But I'm sure that implementing some of the systems that are in this country right now in Sri Lanka would have been beneficial for the country. And we've really, with our independence, we've not really, you can't blame the whole population for that. You have to blame the politicians, but the politicians are put in place by various populations, right, through the democratic process, and we haven't made very intelligent democratic decisions as a country, as a nation. So I do feel that, I feel it sits quite comfortably, the whole.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with you. I mean, it's not an easy discussion. I mean, my ancestors used to kill the British just after the First World War. So I'm a staunch. Well, my ancestors were staunch anti-British, and here I am in the UK, sounding like a Brit, eating fish and chips, and I used to watch EastEnders. But look, I mean, before the Brits came in, we didn't know what natural resources were. And, before the Brits came in, we didn't have any proper structural infrastructure. And I think in any society, particularly the lower ends of the social class, they benefit more from very good infrastructure. The better your infrastructure as a nation, the lower rungs in society benefit the most from improved infrastructure. So, and I think that's undeniable. And the best infrastructure, for Iraq anyway, was sort of 50s and 60s, and 70s, where there was a very close relationship with Britain. What can I say?
Yeah,
Results are results.
yeah. I suppose as you say, this is a discussion that will always go on, and you can always discuss the benefits and the disbenefits and the merits and the various atrocities and so on. And it's just, I feel that nations act in self-interest.
Yeah.
And if any other population was in possession of such power and might, they would have most likely done the same. It's unlikely that human beings being human beings, that that another nation might have acted. Well, there's a possibility that they would have acted differently, but I feel that when you have power and the amount of the capacity to the strength that the British Empire had, I mean, if that was given to someone else, would they have acted more responsibly? Who knows?
Yeah. Well, I mean, they had a system that worked, and at the time it was very effective. Looking back at, the world's a different place now, and that's not how we operate anymore. And I think it doesn't make sense to kind of treat like for like when the world back then was totally different.
Yes,
And then
absolutely.
and then we judge them with our own current standards. I mean, it's a bit like, when I look at ophthalmic surgery, ophthalmic surgery 50 years ago, it's unfair to judge the surgery that we do today to the surgery that we did 50 years ago.
Absolutely.
And I think that's disingenuous of us to say, oh, look at them and look how archaic they are, and look how, all the other derogatory terms that, one can use, because we have moved on. I mean, I have personally moved on since 5 years ago. The stuff that I did 5 years ago, I cringe, to the stuff that I did 5 years ago. And, I think it's reasonable to take that analogy to how, the big nations used to act 100 and 200 years ago.
I totally agree. Yeah, it's not fair to judge, things that, I mean, so one of the things that people would do sometimes is they would judge people from 1,000 years ago or 800 years ago on the same principles that we hold today. And I think that's really quite ridiculous, because the world is a completely different place.
Yeah. And I mean, to be honest with you, it sort of shows you how, I mean, it shows you how kind of maybe small-minded they are to do that judgment, or maybe how simplistic, their way of thinking is, maybe, for them to do that comparison.
Yeah, agreed.
So, we're coming towards the end of the podcast, and I'm a fan of watches, and you're a fan of watches. So, what are your kind of top 3 watches that you always, they always tick the box, they always do the right thing?
Well, I'd have to say,
apart from your company, of course, apart from your watches, of course.
I'm disappointed that you put that proviso on my list, but anyway, I would say that for me, there are 3. Well, I suppose there are 3 brands that stand out for me, and the 3 brands for me are obviously a Seiko. Okay, Seikos are, I think, they're a fantastic brand. It was my first watch. It lasted for longer than I expected. They are reasonable. They're priced very well for what you're getting, and they have a newer, more kind of upmarket range called Seiko Grand, which are competitors to Rolex and all the other big brands. So I think they're a very good brand. I've met a lot of the Seiko mechanics and engineers when I traveled to various countries to look at movements. But yeah, and I can guarantee that the movements are very good, and I've seen them, and very durable, and I would definitely always have a Seiko in my collection, and I have got a couple in my collection right now. Second brand I would say that I would go for is, of course, this is not a question, or it's going to be quite cliche. Obviously, is Rolex. Okay. They've obviously created a name. They have continuously innovated over the years. I don't know if they're innovating, whether you could call what they're doing innovation right now. Okay, because a lot of the different watches are, essentially rehashes of collections they've always had. But back in the day, in the 1950s, 60s, Rolex were, probably, well, they still are the most innovative, or one of the most innovative watchmaking companies around, ever. Okay, they're a Goliath, and the fact that their watches actually increase in price after manufacture are evidence to this fact. And then, of course, the third brand, that's a difficult one, but I would say the third brand that I'm absolutely in love with, and I would say are worth investing in and make really good watches, probably slightly blown out of proportion, but nonetheless, is Audemars Piguet. Love their Royal Oak. Just no watch compares to that. And if I could, have a fourth one, I would say Patek Philippe, the Nautilus. That would be another fantastic brand, and another watch that, fantastic for investment, fantastic make, fantastic brand. Yeah. But this is me talking about the Rolex, but the other two.
Yeah, I mean, Rolex just have an amazing brand and sort of marketing strategy. They seem to be able to sort of pull it out on a regular basis. And yeah, I mean, so you're not a fan of Richard Mille then, because there's something about those watches that's strange.
Yeah, they're not the good watches. I just can't. He created a fantastic piece that, I don't know how he managed to do it in the time span he's done it in 10, 15 years. Obviously, they're stalwarts of the watch industry, and he broke off and went ahead and designed, made his own brand. I can't see why I would pay close to 150,000 to 200,000 pounds for Richard Mille. Yes, they're beautiful watches. They're fantastic skeleton watches. But it's I would happily wear one. But no, I wouldn't put them in my top three or top four. But no, I am extremely, extremely impressed and inspired by Richard Mille. I think they've done a fantastic job.
You think you'll be thinking about sort of a skeleton watch for your brand? Is that something on the?
Yes. So at the moment, I want to try and build the brand a bit more.
Yeah.
I need to try and develop the story a bit more, and I need to try and really try and get the brand in a position in terms of visuals and story as best as I can. And to that front, actually, I'll be taking part in a watch exhibition in June, hopefully. So I'll send you the details, and if you want to come along, please do come and visit. It's
Yeah,
in
yeah.
London.
Yeah. Send us the details, and we can put it on the on the show notes so people can come along as well and meet you, and
Yeah, because I'll be there. I'll be there, and you can talk to me, and we can talk about
yeah.
watches all day.
Great, wonderful. How can people get hold of you? I mean, obviously we'll leave the link in the show notes. What's the best way of people getting hold of you?
So email me on founder@hawchester.com. I'm also on LinkedIn, Shehab Jabir. And then if you can visit our website as well, www.hawchester.com. Got all our watches on there, and direct email to me. If you message, it'll come to me. So yeah, all of those different ways.
Lovely. Thank you, Shahab. It's been great. Thank you so much.
The pleasure's been all mine, actually.